Today I'd like to welcome to the studio Alison Taylor and James Cohen. Welcome.
Thank you.
Alison is the director at the Sustainability Nonprofit Network, BSR, where she focuses on human rights, social risk, ethics, and stakeholder engagement. Prior to this, Alison had a long career in political risk, due diligence, and investigations, and she is a big advocate of sustainability teams working more closely with the Compliance and Ethics Department to meet business challenges of the future. James is an anti-corruption professional with a focus on international development and security sector reform. He has worked on corruption's impact on conflict, human rights, peacekeeping, and security systems. He is particularly focused on the range of actors required to address the connection between conflict and corruption, including the business sector. They have both been generous and prolific guest authors on my blog, and it's a pleasure to have them here today. They recently published a two-part post on my blog. The first part was titled Global Trends and Business Ethics, followed by part 2, an organizational response to global compliance challenges. So let's talk about global trends first. So Alison, the growth of the internet is not a new trend. But you are arguing that 2016 is a pivotal year for transparency. Why do you say that, and what do you mean by hypertransparency?
Hi, Richard. Thanks for having me back. I think that, the growth of the internet, connectivity, that's a long-term seismic shift that has implications across business, society, politics, every dimension of human life. And I think, it tends to be, it's kind of going on in the background. You see its implications everywhere, but, sometimes certain events happen where you can say, aha, we can now say the landscape has definitively changed. And I think these large-scale data leaks are not new, obviously. They began with WikiLeaks, we've had Snowden, we've had Luxembourg, but I think the combination of Unaoil and the Panama Papers this year have sort of fundamentally, for the ethics and compliance industry, ushered in this, we're not in Kansas anymore.
Right.
We're dealing with a very, very different environment in terms of how we treat and manage information, how we disseminate information, and how we understand concepts of privacy. I would bet that the babies being born today will have a very, very, very different concept of what privacy and openness means. But with the growth of wearables and so on, much of the change is yet to come.
Sure.
But if you're thinking very concretely about what does this mean for ethics and compliance now, we've got a lot of questions out there about due diligence, about privacy, about confidentiality, and standard approaches that have really been used over the last decade or so coming under a lot of scrutiny.
Indeed. Well, so how do you think, just a little bit drilling down deeper into the prior question, how do you think hypertransparency will affect corporate anti-corruption programs? What trends would you expect to see?
Well, I think, we can no longer be certain within a corporation that data will remain private. Clearly, the new breed of whistleblowers who focus on these large data leaks and think about this in very heroic terms are targeting the intermediaries.
Right.
Both Mossack Fonseca and Unaoil were intermediaries. A couple of New York law firms have been hit up. And these organizations are repositories of large amounts of corporate data. So I think that's at the moment very, very scary and raises a lot of questions about how companies can and will operate in future that are very profound and very transformational. In the short term, I think we need to think about due diligence. We need to think about whether an obsession with documenting technical proof of bribery when the entire risk profile of an organization may look appalling is really a sustainable approach. And we maybe need to move away from can we prove a bribe took place to what is the reputation and stakeholder profile and connections and consequences of this organization, and do we want to be working with them? And that's a very, very different way of thinking.
It's a much higher altitude view of risk than a due diligence program per se.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, James, you referenced the Unaoil scandal and the Panama Papers as examples of how corruption is certainly more prominent in the headlines, especially this year. You also share how various actors, including government and civil society, are now increasingly aware of the systemic drivers of corruption. Is this attributable solely to the media coverage that we've been talking about, or are there other issues that have impacted awareness?
Media is definitely part of it, because the media is getting that message out there of these large-scale issues. I mean, the fact that Panama Papers is so intricately linked to investigative journalism shows the power of media in showing corruption for what it is. But I think the second part is just the sheer impact of a lot of these corruption scandals. It used to be said corruption, and still said that corruption greases the wheels of bureaucracy.
Right.
However, you keep going through that, you get grease fires, and those fires are essentially coming up. In the case of Indonesia, quite blatantly, as the government and multinationals and local farmers colluded on burning highly flammable marshland that goes off every year. In 2015, burned down thousands of acres or hectares and sent toxic clouds into the rest of Southeast Asia. You can't avoid that, and people want answers now to these things. People want accountability, and it comes back to corruption was a huge part of that. You look at things like housing price spikes in major cities like London or New York, and investigative journalists and civil society have seen that luxury property is a huge conduit for corrupt money to be brought into these cities through Western enablers. And this is also coming through conflict zones. So say people in Ukraine knew that their money was being filtered out of their country into different financial centers. But now people in London are seeing that that corruption overseas is impacting their housing prices as well. So the global connectivity of all this, it used to be people were removed or corruption happened far away, and citizens didn't have the means to collaborate together to get their message out. But with modern tools of transparency, of social media, people can collaborate together, and the impacts are coming. And I think at the end of the day, corruption and security really brings it into perspective. The security failures in Iraq, the security failures in Nigeria, in Ukraine, it can't be avoided that these are hugely parts of corruption. Ghost soldiers, poor procurement, money being skimmed off the top, and now corruption's impact is being recognized at national security levels. So media, yes, bringing it into scope, but the sheer impact and scale of the fallout of corruption is making people take notice.
Interesting. I was just reading an article on the way here about the recent bombings in Iraq and how they were using handheld explosive detection devices that they knew were not operating. And the person that sold them, you know, was just sentenced over in the UK. So there really is a connection between security.
Corruption really does kill.
Yeah, absolutely. And Alison, how do you think the growing public interest in corruption and human rights will affect how companies behave in the future? What do you see as the sort of future impact?
Wow, a really big question. I mean, I think James has described very well how corruption, which used to be falsely perceived as a developing country problem, is now, it's much more difficult to kind of ignore the connections. So corruption has become an issue of huge popular interest, popular concern, has the ability to topple governments, huge driver of political risk. So One thing will be the need to, and back to my due diligence point, not focusing on can we see whether there are allegations about this third party, but companies considering how they operate within the wider system, how they are perceived publicly, how their relationships affect the way they do business. Human rights is another area where I think there's a huge amount of kind of energy and innovation, and this will be something that definitely comes on the regulatory radar. What human rights framework suggests is that you should not just focus on risk, but on the impact of your operations. So I think we'll see a move from kind of risk assessments and risk and opportunity to also considering the wider impact of the business, and you will determine strategy by looking both at the risks facing your business and the impacts that you can have, and chart a path through that way. It's going to be bumpy, but I think what we will see is businesses that are much more engaged with their wider communities and in a better position to compete.
It's interesting. It's almost as if you're both proposing that the optics of where you do business and who you do business with should not be ignored. So while there'll never be a substitute for a sort of drill down, whether it's a advisory firm or a law firm, about a particular party and market, you also have to look holistically what's going on in this country, what's going on in this industry, and sort of what's the wider picture here as opposed to just this narrow focus on this one entity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. And that's something that's being talked about in circles about foreign aid assistance and especially military assistance to countries. What is the risk, especially the fallout in human rights and corruption that goes on in some of these countries, and are Western countries supplying them, and what impact does that have?
Well, James, you cite open government data as a critical tool for citizens and civil society to combat corruption. How is open data being used by civil society organizations to hold governments accountable? And do you think there are challenges that need to be overcome for greater success?
I mean, open data is essentially just that the government's putting that information out there, contracts through Publish What You Pay, EITI, and giving that access. So especially, say examples, one.org has an amazing map of examples of where communities have used open data to track down money that wasn't given back to them through corporate taxes, through multinationals, or money that wasn't distributed to community projects. So say an example of in Kenya, money gets sent down to communities through devolved funds, and local NGOs there trained social auditors. They taught people within the community to read the data that the money was coming down to. And these social auditors managed to see that projects weren't getting done properly because of the contracts. Things were far behind, and because the people within the community saw this data, they managed to go back to their government and make these demands. They had the tools there, and they had the information, and all of a sudden productivity on a lot of these community projects went up. New contracts went to better companies to get them done. So that was power going back into local communities. Now the challenge, it's a definite wave that's going on, the open government movement. There's more countries getting involved. There's challenges, of course, to that, which is the literacy of the open data. You can have all this data out there, and even companies see this as big data issues. You need to mine through that. You need to know what it means. And so civil society working with local communities, that's one example, but you have to empower those civil societies to do that. So there's the literacy, there's even the language, making sure in different communities that this information, if the government in one country official language is English, but there's, say, something about 70 languages within a country, everybody needs to be able to access it through maybe not just internet, but through radio, through mobile phones, through even bulletin boards and community centers. And then I would also say there's another part of corruption literacy, and that's connecting the dots. It's not just a matter of reading the numbers, but people measure corruption in numbers most of the time. But it's exactly as Alison said, it's impact as well. its money was lost on faulty roads, but if, say, an earthquake hits or other natural disasters, and that road falls apart due to shoddy work, then corruption had a part to play in that. Some people will say that people in highly corrupt countries, no, of course there's corruption, but there's connecting it to the human rights, there's connecting it to kleptocracy, there's connecting it to keeping the country back. It's not just the one-off frustration.
Right.
So I would say that's part of corruption literacy, is making sure communities see the larger connection.
Interesting. So Alison, as a sort of final question for our part 1 interview, stakeholder trust. What is it? And why do you think it's so important for companies to consider? How can companies better understand and respond to what you call the growth of civil society and to what James just referenced?
Well, I think stakeholder trust is the degree of trust that stakeholders have in your business.
Internal, external, or both?
Internal, external. The traditional approach has been that the only stakeholder that matters is your shareholder,
Right.
and you focus unilaterally on maximizing shareholder value. But if we think about other stakeholders in a business, their employees, their customers,
Right.
their suppliers, they're the general public. So to act as if those stakeholders don't matter is actually kind of crazy.
Right.
I think you know, the challenge comes in how you therefore kind of measure the influence of different stakeholders and how you engage and how you respond to those desires. And so I think that's been the kind of problem with operationalizing stakeholder trust. But we're in a situation. There's a crisis of confidence in business
Right.
and politics. If you don't focus on trust and relationships and collaboration, I would argue you're not going to have a business in the long term. So I think it's a powerful way to consider how your business operates that goes beyond reputational risk.
Mm-hmm.
It can drive innovation and it can drive long-term survival. And I think it's a much more powerful concept than shareholder value at this point in time if we just look around at what's happening in the world.
I wonder if students will be studying the Volkswagen case as an example of that.
Exactly. It's a
right?
perfect example.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, thank you for your time, and we'll look forward to part 2 of the interview and talking about some solutions. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard.
Take care.